My son-in-law spent 3 years bragging about the old man his wife married into, a quiet, broke retiree who fixed his own gutters and drove a truck with 210,000 miles on it. He had no idea that same old man signed his paycheck every other Friday. My name is Walter Greaves, 68 years old, from Marion, Ohio. A man who still ate breakfast at the counter of Dell's Diner every morning at 6:15 because the coffee was $1.10 and nobody there asked me for anything. I thought hiding what I built was protecting my family. I was wrong about who needed protecting. 2. CTA #1. Before I tell you what happened at that dinner table, hit subscribe if you like stories about quiet people who turn out to be a lot less quiet than everybody assumed. And stick around, because where this one goes, you won't see coming. Now let me tell you about the man across that table from me, and why I spent 3 years letting him believe I was nobody. 3. Antagonist. Introduction. His name was Bradley Kessner, 34 years old, and he married my daughter Emily in a backyard ceremony in Delaware, Ohio, 5 years ago. Under a string of lights, his mother insisted on hanging herself. I'd known Bradley for those same 5 years, and in all that time I thought I knew the shape of him, the way he chewed his ice after he finished a soda, 3 pieces at a time, like a habit he'd never broken since childhood, the way he tied his shoes in a double knot, even for a 5-minute walk to the mailbox. The cologne he wore, something citrus and sharp, that he reapplied at exactly 4 p.m. before he left the office, like clockwork, like a man clocking out of one version of himself and into another. He drove a leased Audi he couldn't really afford and told people it was paid off. He called his mother every Sunday at noon, without fail, sitting on the back porch, with his voice dropping into something younger, something I never quite heard him use with Emily. There was one thing I noticed early on and let go of, the way you let go of small stones in your shoe because the walk isn't over yet. Bradley never asked me a single real question about my life before Emily. Not where I'd worked, not what I'd done for 30 years, not how I'd afforded the house I still lived in, outfitted with nothing newer than a decade. I told myself it was politeness. I told myself a lot of things. 4. Ordinary day. That Tuesday started like every other Tuesday of my retirement. I was up at 5:40, coffee going by 5:50, out the door to walk the 2 miles around Lincoln Park before the heat came in. Back home by 7 to read the Marion Star on the porch, with my dog Chief settled at my feet. I changed the oil in my truck that afternoon myself, the way I always did, because 30 years of doing my own maintenance wasn't something I unlearned just because I could afford not to. Emily called around 4 to remind me about Friday, dinner with Bradley's parents, the Kessners, out at some new steakhouse on the east side of Columbus. "Just be yourself, Dad," she said, and I remember laughing under the hood of the truck, because being myself was exactly the problem nobody in that family understood yet. 5. Inciting incident. The call that started unraveling things came 2 days before that dinner, from a man named Curtis Boyle, a repairman who did haystack work for 3 properties I owned around Marion, none of which had my name on the paperwork the tenants ever saw. "Mr. Greaves? Curtis here, over at the Delaware Street unit." His voice was casual, the way it always was when he called about a filter or a thermostat. "What's going on, Curtis?" I said. "So, funny thing," he said, and I could hear him shifting something metal in the background. "I had a fella stop by yesterday asking questions about the building. Said he was doing some kind of due diligence, asked who owned it, asked about revenue on the unit. What'd he look like? Younger guy, nice car, Audi, I think. Had on one of them company polos, Kessner Freight polos, actually, now that I think on it." I set my coffee down slow. "Kessner Freight? Yeah. Said his name was Bradley. Said he worked there. Asked was I contracted by the company or the owner directly, and I told him the owner, and he asked who that was, and I said I wasn't at liberty, on account of you telling me years back not to give that out to anybody. You did right, I told him, and I meant it, but my mind was already turning something over that had no business turning yet. Anyway, he left a card, Said if I ever needed Havac work referred out, to call him. Struck me as odd, a freight company fella handing out cards for AFAC leads. I thanked Curtis and hung up, and I sat at my kitchen table for a long time with Chief's head on my knee, running through what that meant. Bradley worked at Kessner Freight, not my company, his family's small regional outfit, or so I'd always understood. But I owned Halloway Logistics Group, the parent company that had quietly acquired Kessner Freight 18 months earlier through a holding entity with a name that meant nothing to anyone who didn't read SEC filings for a living. Bradley didn't work for his family's company anymore. He worked for mine. And apparently, in the last few days, he'd been asking around Marion about a property owner who happened to share tenants with 3 addresses I quietly held. 2 days later, my attorney, a sharp, unhurried woman named Deborah Osei, who'd handled my holdings for over a decade, called me with something that made the coffee in my stomach turn cold. "Walter, I need you to see something," she said. "There's an internal inquiry that got flagged. Someone in the Marion Regional Office pulled ownership records tied to the Halloway holding entity. Twice. Same employee badge both times." "Whose badge?" "Bradley Kessner's." I looked out my kitchen window at Chief chasing a squirrel he had 0 chance of catching, and I thought about the dinner 2 nights away, and I thought, he's not just curious. He's looking for something specific, and I didn't yet know if what he was looking for was me, or something else entirely, something that would turn this whole story sideways before it was through. 6. First twist. Role reversal. What I did not expect was the knock on my door the next morning from a man I'd never met, holding a folder and a badge from the Marion County Auditor's Office. "Mr. Greaves, I'm following up on a discrepancy report filed against 3 properties under the Halloway holding entity. Your names come up as the beneficial owner of record." "That's right," I said, careful, the way 30 years of business had trained me to be careful with strangers holding folders. "There's an allegation here, anonymous, of rental income underreporting tied to those addresses. I have to ask you some questions." I stood in my own doorway, in a cardigan with a coffee stain on the sleeve, being treated like a man under suspicion, in the town where I'd built half of what still stood on Main Street, because somebody, and I had a very specific somebody in mind, had gone looking for a reason to make an anonymous report. "Who filed it?" I asked, already knowing he couldn't tell me. "Can't say, sir. It's anonymous by law, but I'll need to review your rent rolls for the last 3 years. I let him in. I gave him coffee. I answered every question with the calm of a man who had nothing to hide and everything to lose in a different way than this stranger understood, because the report wasn't really about my properties. It was a probe. Somebody was testing how deep the walls went before they knocked on the real door. 7. Scene marker plus reflection. I want you to understand something, because I think a lot of you listening have felt this exact thing and never had the words for it. There is a specific, cold loneliness in being suspected by strangers for things you didn't do, while the person who actually set it in motion sits at your family's dinner table calling you Pop and asking you to pass the rolls. That auditor treated me like a man with something to hide, and for the first time in my life, sitting across from him in my own kitchen, I understood that I did, not a crime, but a truth. And someone I loved was digging for it with both hands. 8. Deeper betrayal discovery. 3 nights after the auditor left, I was looking for a flashlight in the hall closet. The kind of ordinary task nobody remembers afterward, except that it's the moment everything changed. And my hand landed on a manila envelope tucked behind Emily's old winter coats, dated from before her wedding. My name was on it in Bradley's handwriting, the same tight, slanted print I recognized from a birthday card he'd once given me. Inside were photocopies, property tax records for the Delaware Street unit, a printout of the Halloway holding entity's registered agent filing, and a single sticky note in that same handwriting that read, "Confirm before the wedding. If true, changes everything." Confirm before the wedding. 5 years ago. He'd known, or suspected, who I was before he ever married my daughter, and he'd said nothing. Not to me. Not, I had to believe, to Emily. He had folded that knowledge up and carried it quietly into our family, like a blade he hadn't decided yet whether to use. I sat down on the hallway floor with that envelope in my lap, and Chief pressed against my leg, and the flashlight I'd gone looking for sat forgotten 3 feet away, because I didn't need it anymore. I could see everything now, clear as day, in the dark. 9. CTA #1.5. If you've been with me a minute, you already know these stories don't stay quiet for long. And here's the thing about betrayal from someone who's watched you closely for years. They don't come at you loud. They come at you patient. They study your habits, your blind spots, your trust, and they wait, sometimes for years, until the moment costs you the most. Bradley had been waiting since before the wedding. I just didn't know it yet. 10. Investigation phase. Socratic dialogue. I called Deborah the next morning and told her to bring in Marcus Webb, a private investigator she'd used twice before on matters too delicate for a normal firm to touch. Marcus was a broad, unhurried man in his 50s who took notes on actual paper and never seemed surprised by anything I told him. "Walk me through the envelope again," Marcus said, sitting across from me at my kitchen table, notepad open. Property tax records, the holding entity filing, and a note. Confirm before the wedding. Dated? No date on the note, but the tax records are from 14 months before the wedding. So he was looking into you before he proposed. Looks that way. You said your attorney flagged an internal records pull at the Marion office. Same badge, twice. When was the second pull? 3 weeks ago. Marcus wrote something down. So there's a gap. He finds something before the wedding, sits on it for 5 years, marries her anyway, and then 3 weeks ago starts digging again. What changed 3 weeks ago? I hadn't thought of it that way. I don't know. You said Holloway acquired Kessner Freight 18 months back through the holding entity. Correct. Did Bradley get promoted around then? I sat back. He did. Regional operations to VP of logistics. I remember Emily mentioning it at Christmas. So he goes from a mid-level manager at a family company to VP at a company that just got quietly bought out. By you. And 18 months later, he starts pulling ownership records again. Marcus tapped his pen twice. Walter, I don't think this is about you owning things. I think he already knew that. I think he's trying to find out something else. Something about how the acquisition happened. Who signed off on what? Whose numbers went where? You're saying he's not digging for blackmail on me? I'm saying I don't know what he's digging for yet. But a man who finds out his father-in-law is worth 9 figures and stays quiet about it for 5 years isn't hunting for money to ask for. He's hunting for leverage he hasn't decided how to use. And leverage like that usually isn't about you at all. It's about something he's protecting, or someone. That word sat heavy in the kitchen. Someone. His father, I said slowly. Kessner Freight was his father's company before we bought it. Was the sale clean? I thought so. Deborah handled the diligence. I'd like her file on that acquisition. Every signature, every disclosure, every number Kessner Freight submitted before the sale went through. Because if there's a discrepancy hiding in there, something his father did, something Bradley's been sitting on, that explains 5 years of silence a whole lot better than simple curiosity does. I looked at the note again. Confirm before the wedding. If true, changes everything. I had assumed for days that, if true, meant my identity. Sitting there with Marcus, I understood for the first time it might have meant something else entirely. Something buried in his own father's books. Something Bradley had spent 5 years quietly trying to keep covered while he watched me from across 100 family dinners, smiling, calling me Pop, and never once asking me a real question about my life. Get me that acquisition file, I told Marcus, and find out exactly what Bradley's father sold us and what he might have left out. 11. Reflection. scale of betrayal. I spent that night going back through 5 years of memory, like a man walking through a house after the furniture's been rearranged in the dark, bumping into things that used to make sense. Every Thanksgiving, Bradley had steered conversation away from my old career. Every time I'd mentioned a business trip, he'd changed the subject fast, almost too fast, like a man closing a door before anyone could see into the room behind it. I thought about his father, Gerald Kessner, a proud, tired-looking man who'd shaken my hand a little too firmly at the wedding and said, "Take care of my company legacy, Walter," in a tone I'd taken for sentiment, and now heard, in memory, as something closer to a warning. You don't marry into a family and spend 5 years protecting a secret about your own father's business unless you believe the truth would cost you everything. Your marriage, your name, maybe your freedom. I wasn't just looking at a man who'd hidden my identity from himself. I was looking at a man who might have built his entire life with my daughter on top of something he was terrified I'd eventually dig up myself. 12. Turning point, I did not call a lawyer to send a letter. I did not confront Bradley at the next family dinner and demand answers across a table of mashed potatoes and forced smiles. I did not call Emily and put doubt in her marriage before I had a single fact worth putting there. I did not go to the auditor's office and clear my name loudly, the way half of me wanted to, just to watch Bradley's face when the suspicion swung back around toward him. I did none of that. What I did instead was quiet and slow, and exactly the kind of thing a man who'd spent 30 years building a company out of nothing knows how to do without anyone in the room ever noticing he's doing it at all. I picked up the phone and called my sister. 13. Second alley plus countermeasure. My sister, Diane Marsh, had spent 26 years as a forensic accountant before she retired, and there wasn't a set of books in Ohio she couldn't read like a bedtime story. "Send me everything Deborah's got on the Kessner freight acquisition," she said, not even asking why yet, because that was Diane. She asked why, after she already had her answer. 3 days later, she called back, and her voice had the flat, careful tone she used when she'd found something real. "Walter, there's 11 months of accounts receivable that don't reconcile. Roughly $420,000 spread across 17 transactions, each one just under the internal audit threshold. Deliberately structured. That's the pattern, yeah. Somebody split real revenue into pieces small enough to avoid triggering review. And Walter, the approvals on 9 of those 17 transactions carry Bradley's initials, not his father's, his. I sat with that for a long moment. So it's not Gerald hiding something from the sale. It's Bradley, hiding something from the takeover. From me. Looks that way. He wasn't protecting his father's secret, Walter. He built his own, right under it, and he's been terrified for 18 months that owning the company meant you'd eventually see the books close enough to notice. Can you build a clean trail? Something that shows exactly where that money went, dated, documented, airtight. Give me 2 weeks, and access to the transaction logs. I'll build you something a forensic auditor could hand a courtroom. Do it quiet, I said. Nobody at that company hears a word. Not HR, not compliance, nobody but you, me, and Marcus. And Bradley. I looked out at Chief, lying in a patch of sun on the porch, unaware, at peace, the way I used to be before an envelope in a hall closet. Bradley gets to keep smiling at dinner a little while longer. He's not the only one in this family who knows how to wait. 14. The performance. The following Sunday, I sat at Emily and Bradley's table and ate pot roast and complimented the gravy and asked Bradley how work was going. And he said, "Busy, you know how it is," and smiled at me the exact same smile he'd been giving me for 5 years, easy and warm and utterly unbothered. A man who had no idea that 80 miles away, my sister was pulling apart the seams of his career, one transaction at a time. Emily put her hand over mine at one point and said, "I'm so glad you two get along so well." And I said, "Your husband's a good man." And I watched Bradley's shoulders relax a half inch at hearing it. and I felt, for the first time in my life, absolutely nothing when I looked at him. Not warmth, not anger, just the calm, flat patience of a man watching a clock tick down that only he could see. 15. Slow burn countdown. Diane needed 14 days to finish tracing the money cleanly enough to survive scrutiny, and I lived through every one of them the same way. Coffee at 6:15, the walk around Lincoln Park, Chief at my feet on the porch, Sunday dinners where I passed the rolls and asked about the weather. 14 days of being exactly the quiet, harmless old man Bradley had always believed me to be, while $420,000, 17 transactions, and 9 sets of initials slowly assembled themselves into something he would not see coming until it was already sitting across the table from him. 16. CTA, #2. If you've made it this far with me, thank you, genuinely, for sitting through the slow part with me, because the slow part is where the real story always lives. Hit that subscribe button if you want to be here for what happens when I finally put that folder on the table. 17. Cliffhanger cutoff. On the 15th day, Diane called while I was still on my morning walk, and her voice had a different weight to it than I'd heard from her yet. "Walter, I need you to sit down. I'm outside, Diane. Just tell me. The $420,000, I traced the last of it. It didn't go to Bradley's personal accounts, not the way we thought. Then where?" There was a pause on the line, the kind that tells you the next sentence is going to change the shape of everything you thought you understood. It went to Emily. End of part 1. Part 2 continues the investigation and the confrontation.